Hi there, this is Katie Groves, and in this video I'm going to be attempting to talk to Christians who wish to be allies or better allies to the satanic ritual abuse survivor community. This is a difficult video for me to make as I am still currently shaken up by an extremely abusive interaction I just had with a supposed member of the Christian community through this channel, and that is part of why I'm making this video now. Once again, someone tried to belligerently evangelize me in an extremely insulting and triggering way, and then when I went to set boundaries, was extremely abusive and hostile towards me. So I thought it was time to make this video. I'm just going to lay out some facts about me. Those who watch my channel probably already know these things. I am a survivor of satanic ritual abuse and MKUltra mind control programming. I was born into a family with ties to the satanic elite, Masonic groups, and the CIA. I systematically fought my way out of that situation by deprogramming myself from an extremely young age, using knowledge of mind control programming that I acquired through my own training as a mind control programmer. I had my big awakening from the programming at 17. Between 17 and 20, I dealt with a lot of accessing, and while I actually just had an experience in which I think I was recently accessed, I have, to my knowledge, been mostly free from accessing for a year. So I am a work in progress. And I will make a video speaking about my recent experience with accessing soon. I just still want to get a handle on that first and understand exactly what happened before I make a video about it. So, that all being said gives you some idea of my background. My religious orientation is pagan. I have thought extensively about Christianity, and I have come to find that that is not the religion for me. I have very definite reasons why. A big one being that I have simply not had personal experience with Jesus, or an entity that I would call Jesus, that I can identify as proof to me that the whole notion of Jesus Christ as my Savior has validity. And because I have not had that experience, I do not have any reason to be a Christian. I also do not like the level of patriarchy found in Christianity and in the Bible. I don't like a lot of what is in the Bible separate from Christ's teachings. Some of the Gospels say things that I do not agree with, that are socially conservative, on a level that's very detrimental to my mental health to try and take on. I do like Christ's teachings, and I think that they're very compatible with the mindfulness practices that I do. While I call myself a pagan, I also consider myself a Buddhist. I have studied Buddhism a lot, absolutely love Buddhist meditations, and find that Christ's teachings are very compatible with that. I wish to learn more about Christianity and the Bible on my own time by deprogramming myself more around religion and then sitting down with the parts of the Bible that pertain specifically to Christ and studying those. I do not, however, wish to be evangelized. I get panic attacks and find it debilitating to my mental health when people try and push Christianity on me. And so that is what this video is about. It's about what I think Christians should and shouldn't do in approaching survivors of satanic ritual abuse. I do not have the right to speak for the entire survivor community because I'm only one person, but I think I can speak in a general enough way that perhaps what I say can be taken as some basic guidelines to be used not just in interacting with me, but in interacting with others in ways that may be effective. The very first thing I want to say about that is I think it is important to acknowledge that survivors of satanic ritual abuse have usually been subjected to some form of mind control programming, whether it be in full-blown government mind control like me, or whether it be in a quote-unquote backwoods cult with just a few members. Ritual abuse and mind control go hand in hand. Ritual abuse is the systematic abuse of others, typically starting in childhood, aimed to break the will of the person. There is an attempt to control. And so I think it is really important to acknowledge that someone who has been through ritual abuse has had people trying to tell them what to think for most of their lives, and their very safety, their very freedom depends on their ability to shield themselves from people who wish to manipulate them and control them mentally, especially around religion. Many survivors of satanic ritual abuse actually grew up in Christian churches, so-called Christian. These aren't actually Christian churches, but so-called Christian churches that were secretly practicing SRA, that used Christianity as a front. And so survivors who've been through that are naturally distrustful of Christianity and naturally self-protective against Christians who may wish to control their minds. And so if you are an evangelist Christian, I really, really urge you to give survivors of RAMC the space that we need to come to our own conclusions about things. If you try to pressure us into thinking the way you think we need to think, even if you think that it will save our soul, you need to understand that we have been pressured all our lives to think in certain ways about God and Satan, Jesus and the Bible. What we need is to go through a period of time in which we are allowed and encouraged to think for ourselves, to work through the abuse we have endured, to work through the thoughts about these things we were programmed to have, and find our own authentic thoughts in our core centers. If Jesus is the way, then it stands to reason that a deprogrammed survivor would accept that for themselves upon finding their core nature. If in the bottom of my heart is the awareness that Jesus is the only way, then it stands to reason that when I fully deprogram myself, I will find that to be true and embrace that as my spiritual path. And so if you want me to become a Christian and you believe that that is true, if you want survivors of SRA to become Christians and you believe that when we fully deprogram ourselves, we will become Christians, then you do not need to evangelize us. It is my understanding that a big part of evangelism, as it was outlined in the Bible, and I'm not knowledgeable on the Bible verses, but from what I've read from secondhand sources, I think that part of the whole concept of evangelism was developed back when Christianity was not well known. When Christians would travel to areas of the Middle East and beyond where people had never heard of Christ before. And so the idea was to expose people to this information for the first time. Someone in 2018, in the Western world especially, but really anywhere, has likely been exposed to Christianity if they're of a certain age. And I think it stands to reason that most SRA survivors have had a lot of exposure to the ideas of Christianity. We may have been taught things about it that were false, but when a mind control survivor begins deprogramming themselves, they quickly begin developing the ability to think freely, and they may have never lost it altogether. So I think it stands to reason that survivors of SRA of a certain age who've been deprogramming themselves from mind control have thought about Christianity extensively, and we do not need someone to explain it to us as if we've never heard of it before. This is something I've encountered with evangelist Christians through this channel and before, is it seems like there are certain people who really don't understand that nowadays most people have been exposed to Christianity. We've heard of the words Jesus and God before. And so we don't need to be educated about what it is. We need to take what we already know of it and form our own conclusions. So I know I haven't really even gotten to the much of the advice part yet for Christians in general. What do I need to say here? I think a big issue, right, in addition to understanding that mind control survivors need space to come to our own conclusions, is understanding that a mind control survivor may deprogram themselves fully, or say they've deprogrammed themselves enough to have a real sense of spirituality, and that sense of spirituality is not Christian. You may again believe that when someone fully deprograms themselves, they will accept Jesus. And as I've not fully deprogrammed myself, I'm not going to argue with you about that. But I have deprogrammed myself enough and practiced spirituality on a level deep enough that I believe I have definitely found some things that work for me. Found some things that bring me in closer connection to God. Found things that help me deprogram myself that are not strictly Christian. And I believe that I have a right to those things. I believe that everyone has a right to practice their religion in the way that they see fit, as long as they're not harming others or imposing upon others with it. So for me, my orientation is pagan and Buddhist. Those are just words that best fit how I practice, that best fit the spiritual tools that I have picked up that I find healing. And if you believe that those things are completely invalid, and you are not capable of having a respectful conversation with me about it, then it would be best if you don't approach people like me about it. That is what I ask. I do not ask that Christians not say that they are Christians. I do not ask that Christians leave their religions at the door. I'm not leaving my religion at the door, and I don't ask you to do so either. In fact, I'm interested. I'm interested in learning more about how you, as a Christian, practice your religion. I am interested to hear about how Jesus has helped you. Not just hear that Jesus has helped you, but actually hear about what it is that Jesus does for you. When you pray, do you hear a voice talk back to you that identifies themselves as Jesus? Or when you pray to Jesus, do you feel a sense of peace and calm that you can't explain? Just like when I pray to the higher powers of my understanding, I experience a sense of peace and calm that I can't explain. And that's why I follow the path that I do. I, as a survivor of satanic ritual abuse, and I don't think I'm alone here in the survivor community, am interested in Christianity. But I'm not interested in Christians trying to control my mind, trying to belligerently convince me, or condescendingly, in a passive-aggressive way, try to convince me. And that's another key word, is do you see yourself as an equal to people who are not Christian? Do you think that as a Christian, you are morally superior to anyone who isn't? I really ask you to introspect. And there are some people who are going to watch this video who are Christians, who are humble, kind people, who don't really need to do this, although I'm sure everyone can benefit from self-reflection. But I'm sure there are people who are going to watch this who are already aware of themselves and don't need this advice. But there are people who aren't. And so for you who aren't, I ask you, do you think that you are better than me? Do you think that I have not yet found the way? And do you think that what I have found that is healing to me is useless because it doesn't involve the word Jesus? Because it doesn't involve me going to church? And I really want you to ask yourself those questions and introspect on it. Another key thing, and I know this is really long, so thank you to anyone who's bearing with me through this. Again, I'm really trying to be helpful to everyone. Speaking as just a member of my community to members of your community, I really want us to all be closer together. So, what was I going to say? I'm sorry, it's hot in here. I kind of dehydrate a lot, and that makes my brain kind of slow. What was I going to say? Survivors of mind control programming often have triggers around Christian terminology and religious terminology in general. There are Christian survivors of SRA, I think, who still feel too triggered around the word Jesus to say it or hear it on a regular basis. A lot is done in programming and satanic abuse to make people fear and hate the word Jesus. And I think it's important to understand that someone who has been traumatized in this way, who says they cannot talk about Christianity or hear about Christianity, who cannot say the word Jesus or hear it, is not necessarily possessed by demonic spirits or channeling some kind of demonic energy. What they are probably experiencing is PTSD. And while I guess that most people who watch this channel know what PTSD is, if you're not familiar with PTSD and DID, which are typical diagnoses for SRA and MC survivors, I encourage you to research those things before approaching people in my community. So what people who are survivors of this abuse are typically experiencing when they recoil at the word Jesus is a symptom of their post-traumatic stress disorder, which is not evil or demonic. It is a natural physiological reaction to trauma. What it means is that when the person hears a word which they associate with their trauma, they may get flashbacks and panic attacks. They may relive the event through a flashback or shut down, freeze, and dissociate, meaning that they check out and enter a trance-like state. This is something that is systematically manipulated through RAMC. Abusers in RAMC repeatedly traumatize their victims and then use their victims' natural traumatic responses to control them. They cultivate the natural response in some people to dissociate, encourage it, and increase the person's capacity for dissociation through repetitive conditioning and trauma, so that the person specifically enters that trance-like state and has that freeze response where they go into a hypnotic trance. And then the programmers are able to manipulate that person because a person in trance is more likely to believe what they were told at face value. And a person who is in a state of high trauma, the part of their brain that thinks critically is likely shut down, or shut down to a large degree. And so it is important to recognize the severity of the abuse that MC survivors have gone through, and to recognize that someone who's having a traumatic response to the word Jesus, or the word God even, is not demonic or evil. They have a mental health condition that is not a mental illness, but is a neurophysiological response to their trauma. So if someone sets boundaries with you about Christianity, what they can and can't talk about, if they tell you that they cannot talk about it at all, you need to respect that and give them their space. because they may not be possessed by demons. They may be having a traumatic response, and to push them will re-traumatize them. Survivors of RAMC may even have suicide programming that activates when they get too anxious and activates when defensive programming is triggered too heavily. And if a person has defensive programming against Christianity and you push that, you could trigger them to kill themselves. Even if you simply mention the word Jesus, you could trigger someone into a very severe panic state if they're not prepared to hear it because of the traumas they've faced in SRA. And so before you even go to mention the word Jesus, I suggest you ask the person. I suggest you first ask the person what their spiritual orientation is, perhaps. Say something like, hey, I'm a spiritual person. I like talking to people about spirituality. I'm curious what your spiritual identity is, if that's something you can talk about or are interested in talking about. I recognize that ritual abuse survivors have been through a lot of religious abuse, and I'm not here to push any religion on you. I'm just curious if you would like to talk about God. And don't even necessarily say God. Just ask if you would like to talk about that stuff. If you would like to talk about spirituality. And see what the person says. And if the person says they are a Christian, then obviously you're a lot more in the clear. But even then, that could be an altar of their system that has been programmed for a contrived form of Christianity that isn't actually authentic, and underneath it, there is a layer of satanic ideological programming. And to push Christianity, or not necessarily push it, but to talk too much about it with too much, in too much terminology, with too many kind of common trigger words, could actually activate that person in a bad way. So even if they tell you you're a Christian, even if they tell you that they're a Christian, even if they tell you they're a Christian, I think it's wise to still tread lightly and get to know the person. Religion is a very personal thing. And to immediately launch into discussions of religion can feel invasive and can just make a person feel uneasy, even if they agree with you, even if they agree with your point of view. So those are some thoughts. And everything else about being an ally really just doesn't have to do with your religion so much as just having empathy and compassion. If you can hold space for people and hold reasonable boundaries with people, you can do a lot to help. I think it is important to note that that SRA is a form of spiritual warfare. If you believe that, I agree with you. But SRA survivors may not see it as spiritual warfare in the same way that you do. So just keeping that in mind, everyone's different, everyone has different beliefs. Trying to break down a person's defensive programming through repeated exposure to words and phrases that traumatize them is not going to work. It may result in extreme pain to them and possibly their own death. Thank you.